Good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning for our continuing education webinar. This is Terrorism Awareness for the Public Safety Telecommunicator. My name is Lee Santel, and I'm the Radio Communications Specialist here at the Rockland County Sheriff's Office. For those of you who are not familiar with our agency, Rockland County is in the lower part of New York State, just north of New York City. We're the smallest county in New York State outside of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Pretty well populated, though. We have a population of about 325,000 people at last count, and our semi-consolidated county PSAP is answering about 208,000 calls per year, 108,000 911 calls, and the other half, the other 100,000, are 7-digit calls. There's my contact information up there on the screen, and again, I encourage everyone, as I always do, if you have questions, comments, feedback, anything like that, please don't hesitate to give me a call or drop me an email after the webinar is over. If you need copies of any documentation or materials or anything, I'll share as much as I can. We do a lot of training. We do online training. We do in-person training. And typically the first place we post our training opportunities is to Facebook. If you're not following us on Facebook after the webinar is over, follow us on Facebook. The handle is 44Control. And if you want to be added to our email list, I keep an email distribution list. Probably a lot of you get my emails about training events that we have. Just shoot me an email and I'll add you to our list so that we'll contact you in the future for our next training event. Just a quick disclaimer, the lawyers make me do it. This webinar is for informational purposes only. Make sure you follow all your local agencies' policies, procedures, rules, regulations, laws, smoke signals, anything like that. You should always make sure that you're doing what your commanding officer or whoever's in charge of you is telling you to do. The information in this particular webinar came from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative. That's a mouthful. NSI, you can find out more information about that at dhs.gov/NSI. And they do have some resources on there, like video training for people from different branches of public safety, including telecommunicators, but they also have some training videos for firefighters, police, the particular when I come from. And I want to give a shout out to the state of Utah Department of Public Safety for providing some of the photos and videos that were used in this webinar. Why Utah? I just happen to like the photos and videos that they have, but I ended up using them for this particular PowerPoint. Quick reminder before we kick off, in September, the later half of September, will be our annual in-service. That's going to be held at our facility in Pomona, New York. It'll be offered on a variety of days and evenings, September 16th through 25th. And you don't have to be an APCO member to come to those. You can just you can register for that. There's no charge for it or anything like that. You can check out all the information online at register.rockland911.org and register online for those programs. It's free, and those continuing education programs are certified by New Jersey Office of Emergency Telecommunications Services. So if you're a New Jersey dispatcher and you need credit hours, you can use those. We have the approval numbers. We'll give them to you. We also have those content of those classes also meets the requirements for New York State's continuing ed requirements for continuing education for telecommunicators. You can check all that out online or shoot me an email after it's over. And lastly, a lot of you found out about this presentation probably through APCO PS Connect. If you're not an APCO member, I hope you'll consider becoming an APCO member. It's very inexpensive and it only takes a few minutes to sign up online. Just hit the website apcointl.org/join. You get so many benefits: training, networking, conferences, and advocacy, and all kinds of other things that APCO offers you. So if you're not a member already, please consider becoming a member, and thus end the commercial. So let's jump into what we're talking about today. We're talking about terrorism awareness for public safety telecommunicators, and we're going to cover quite a bit, but one thing I will say, we won't spend that much time talking about, we'll spend a little bit of time, but not that much time talking about what constitutes suspicious activity. I think, ever since the actions of September 11th, and certainly, we have things going on today, even in the past week, with New York City and things. So there's definitely plenty of, I think everyone's fairly aware of what constitutes suspicious. We'll review it, but what I really wanted to cover was what information that the telecommunicator should be collecting when they're getting calls about suspicious activity? What exactly is it that we should be obtaining from the caller or from the person reporting? And what is suspicious activity? We'll talk briefly about that. But what descriptions, the what, the where, the when, and the how, and yes, the who. We'll talk about why the who is important. We will talk a little bit about the 8 signs of potential terrorist activity, and we'll discuss that. We'll talk about what a fusion center is and how it fits into the puzzle. And we'll talk a little bit about how the telecommunicator fits into the whole role of terrorism prevention in terms of the risk to responder safety and things like that. So speaking of September 11th, I hate to beat that dead horse over and over again. I think everybody wants to start with September 11th. But one of the things that we learned after September 11th is that there's a lot of information coming into public safety, both in the PSAP level and elsewhere, about seemingly unrelated matters that actually turn out to be something bigger. We get reports of criminal activity. We get potential criminal activity. We get reports of things that don't seem criminal. They just seem like typical day-to-day activities that people report. But these activities that these suspects are doing are actually what we call precursor actions. They're sort of getting ready to do the terrorist act, just like a regular criminal. A regular criminal, quote-unquote traditional criminal, regular criminal, like a robbery, somebody who's thinking about committing a robbery, he'll go to the bank the day before. He'll check out where the security cameras are. He'll see what time the bank opens. He'll see what time the bank closes. He sort of cases the joint before the actual act. And similarly regarding like a burglary suspect, they drive through the neighborhood the day before. They see what time people leave. They see what time people come home. They see who has the expensive stuff in the house or fancy cars. They sort of get things ready and get their planning in order before they commit the act, because it's something that they want to make sure goes off without a hitch. And terrorist suspects are no different. They're getting ready and preparing everything before they get started. I think it's fair to say that most terrorist actions, I'm sure there are some that are the exception, but I think it's fair to say that most terrorist actions are not crimes of opportunity. It's not something where they suddenly woke up one morning and said, hey, you know what, I think I want to, hurt people and so forth. This is something that they have to plan out far in advance, especially if personal risk is involved. If they're planning to go in and, commit some sort of suicide attack or something like that, they're not going to want that attempt to go to waste and end up getting killed without pulling off their action. They're going to want to plan that out and make sure that everything is 150% before they get started, so that their efforts aren't a waste. And some of the precursor actions they engage in could be criminal, could be not criminal, could be suspicious, could be not suspicious. Making plans, acquiring materials, collecting information. Sometimes they're criminal, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're suspicious, sometimes they're not. Going to the local U-Haul and renting a truck, not illegal, probably not suspicious. Going to the local Home Depot or Lowe's and buying a bunch of fertilizer or other chemicals, probably not illegal, not necessarily suspicious. The key to it comes in when we see that we have the same person or group of people in a particular time frame who are doing all these, ordinarily normal and unsuspicious activities, or they might be doing some other criminal activities as well, but they're sort of doing those all together. We have the same person who rented the truck and the same person who bought the fertilizer or whatever, or the chemicals, the same person who bought plane tickets, and the same person who is talking to somebody who just came into the country. And also this could be the same person who's committing other smaller crimes, larceny, fraud, robbery, burglary, whatever. When we see those come together, that's when we sort of say, hey, wait a minute, this is not just an innocent act that, the guy was just renting a truck or whatever. Or this is not just a low-level crime that the guy was, stole something off the store shelves. Or this is not just a guy who rented a truck. This is something bigger. And getting that conclusion when we're just sitting there taking 911 calls is sort of hard to arrive at. We don't see the whole big picture. We don't realize that, when we get a 911 call that, they just picked up a guy for burglary or a drug deal or something, we're focusing on that small act. We don't really see the whole bigger picture that this same person who was involved in the drug deal is associated with a guy who also did this and another person who did that. And that's hard. And that's where terrorism data analysis comes into, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So when we're getting reports of these precursor actions, They might not necessarily seem criminal or suspicious by themselves. You might just be getting a call on the PSAP about what seemingly is a low-level crime. It seems like nothing. Guy rented a few trucks, big deal. Guy paid for chemicals with cash, big deal. It needs further analysis, and that's why suspicious activity reporting is so important. We need to report that activity, whether we consider it suspicious or illegal now or not. We need to recognize that activity needs to be reported to a place where they can sort of look at the bigger picture, plug in data points from all different agencies, from all different areas, all different people, all different parts of the region, and sort of plug that information together and analyze it, and then come out with a conclusion that there might be something bigger going on. Because we won't be able to see, based on those smaller actions at the ground level, what the bigger picture is. I mean, maybe we will, and if you are, maybe you're lucky enough to see that. But most of the time, it's hard to see that when you're just a 911 call taker taking the call, or you're the police officer on the street, or whatever it is. So when we say suspicious activity, what does that mean? Report suspicious activity if you see it. If you see something, say, what do you mean suspicious activity? Well, the official definition is, observed behavior reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning for terrorism or a criminal act. But the bottom line is we're talking about actions that you get reported to you, or things that a caller observes or reports that could be a signal of future crime. And in this case, we're talking about terrorism. And again, this actually happened recently. I don't know if anybody from the New York region is following the news recently. They just had this in New York City recently with the subway, and the guy entered the subway station and he placed the rice cookers, pressure cookers, whatever they were, and he placed them in various places in the subway platforms, and somebody, a civilian who was walking in the train station, saw that and alerted the local counterterrorism cop for New York City, the NYPD, and they ended up investigating it. It turned out it was not a bomb, but it was definitely worth investigating, because I think it was meant to be implied that it was a bomb, and luckily nobody got injured in this case, which is a good thing. So people are going to report things, and that's a good thing. Sometimes those things pan out. I would say that's the minority of the time. The majority of the time, it doesn't end up being anything, and that's okay. We'll talk about that a little later on. So these precursor actions, we know that precursor actions are important because in previous terrorist acts, analyzing the terrorist act later on, we realized that, hey, if we had just noticed this smaller action, or if we had just noticed this suspicious activity that the person was doing or the people were doing prior to the act, if we had just seen those common things, those commonalities that we typically see in terrorist acts, we would have known. Now, just because somebody's doing one of these actions, these suspicious activities, it does not necessarily mean that they're doing a criminal action either now or later. It could be completely innocent. It's not illegal to rent a U-Haul truck, or it's not illegal to buy most chemicals or fertilizer, whatever it is. But these actions do provide justification for taking a closer look. And I think a lot of people feel that when they see those ads about, whether civilians or public safety, they feel like if they saw something and they say something, they make a report to the fusion center or to the local law enforcement agency, they're afraid they're going to get laughed off the block, or they're afraid that they're going to erroneously cause somebody to get arrested suddenly for no reason. That's not common. Look, if the guy is standing there with a bomb strapped to his chest, or if he's out there with a weapon right now, obviously, yes, the resources are going to be sent in. And if you're the dispatcher, if you're the telecommunicator working the desk and you get that report, obviously, send in the troops. But most of these sort of suspicious activity reports don't end up with a giant SWAT team banging down somebody's door. Maybe later if they get more justification, but that's not something that's happening right now. The reason for reporting these suspicious activities is to give investigators a justification for additional investigation, for further analysis. And yes, most of the time it turns out to be nothing, and that's okay. That's a good thing. We're blessed in this country that 99.9% of the people have no interest in hurting anyone, and are good people and want to do the right thing. But there is that small amount of times, that small number of times, and fortunately it is a small number of times, a small percentage, that it turns out that it is a nefarious action, that the person is planning something. And again, I don't know if you've been following the news recently. I mean, there's been some that have been executed. There have been some actions that have gone through, unfortunately, successfully. And there have been other ones that have been thwarted by the authorities based on careful analysis, careful investigation, because people saw something and they said something. And that, obviously nobody wants to even have this problem, but the fact that we were able to avoid it is a good thing. So when people call into the 911 center, when people call into the ECC, what information are we getting from them? Mostly the information that we're going to be getting from them is the typical stuff that we get from virtually all 911 callers: the what, the where, the when, the how. Obviously, we do want to pick apart what the caller's saying and make sure that we're recording exactly what they actually observed, not what they assumed or not what they believed based on their own prejudices or whatever. We do want to get exactly what they observed or read or saw or whatever it may be, where it happened, when it happened, how, if there's particular tools, methods, vehicles, anything else like that. I think sometimes we have a problem when it comes to the last one in suspicious activity, and that's the who. I think everyone would agree that some folks have a particular predisposition for particular suspects. People who have certain colored skin or from a particular, like olive or brown colored skin, Middle Eastern background. They speak an alternative language, especially a Middle Eastern language like Arabic. They dress in a particular way. They emigrated from another country, from particular countries in the Middle East. There seems to be a lot of predisposition to say, oh, well, if the person has one of those attributes, then it's more likely to be a possible terrorist action, whereas if they're American, white, Christian, English-speaking, whatever, then there's no, it's probably nothing. It's probably not suspicious. We have to get out of that mindset. Yes, there are dangerous people who come from the Middle East who have attacked us in the past, and they're still trying to attack us now, both here and overseas. But there are also plenty of people who are American by birth, full citizens of the United States, white skin, they speak English, and they grew up in America, and they went to local schools and everything else. And these people are also planning and executing terrorist acts against our homeland. And we need to make sure that we're investigating or reporting those people just as much as the people with an alternative color, skin, or background or whatever. So when we're getting that information from the caller, when we're getting a report from a caller of suspicious activity, do we care what the person looked like and what their dress was and what their accent was and their nationality and religion and all that? Do we care about that? 100% we do care about that, and we definitely want to collect all that information, their personal descriptors, their name, their address, their phone number, who they associate with, what social media or internet, all that stuff that the caller is able to provide us. But when we collect that information, how we handle the incident, whether we report it or who we report it to or how we handle the information that we got should not be affected by whether the person is of a particular skin color or a particular ethnicity or whatever. We have to treat them all as potentially serious because there are plenty of people of skin and nationalities and everything else of all types, all backgrounds, who are committing terrorist acts. There are some very famous ones, obviously. Some of the people watching this webinar might not be familiar with the image that's on the screen. In case you're not, this is the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The guy who blew up this building, Timothy McVeigh, born and bred in the United States, not a Muslim or ISIS or anything like that. He was a domestic terrorist. But you don't have to go back that far for those who might not be familiar with this particular photo. This one is 2017. This is the Mandalay Bay shooting in Las Vegas. Certainly there are plenty of terrorist actors out there who are Middle Eastern in origin, and I'm not even going to bother mentioning all of those. There's been quite a few of them, unfortunately. Again, going back to September 11th, you don't need to go much further than that. But regardless of their background or their nationality, they're out there, and we need to make sure that when we're getting these calls of suspicious activity, the truck rental or they're buying chemicals or they're taking photos or whatever it is, do I want to collect the description information about the suspect, their skin color and their language and their height and their weight and their clothing and their vehicle and their, all that? I definitely do want to collect that information. It's very, very important. I just want to make sure that we're not changing how we handle the call. We're not going to downplay or elevate the suspicion level. We're not going to put it any higher or lower just because of whether the person has a particular ethnicity or background.
Oh my God.
When a homegrown terrorist attack occurs, the immediate association might seem obvious.
The FBI has been routinely finding homegrown radicals.
And the FBI is very, very concerned about those travelers.
Breathless media reports about jihadist terrorism. But there's another homegrown terrorist problem on the rise.
I'm here because our Republican values are, number one, standing up for local white identity. Our identity is under threat. Number two, the free market. And number three, killing Jews.
Right-wing extremists are one of the biggest and most consistent sources of domestic terrorists in the U.S. Because of the movement's deep-seated place in American society, the hate crimes continue. James Alex Fields Jr. has been charged with second-degree murder after allegedly ramming his car into a crowd of counter-protesters at the white nationalist rally in Virginia, killing one woman and injuring at least a dozen. Adam W. Purrington has been charged with killing one Indian man and injuring 2 other people after he opened fire in a Kansas bar. James H. Jackson admitted that he traveled to New York to target and kill black men. He fatally stabbed one man with a sword before being arrested by authorities. And Jeremy Joseph Christian fatally stabbed 2 men on a Portland train after shouting anti-Muslim hate speech. Those are just some of the most visible incidents already under investigation as hate crimes in 2017. The frequency of right-wing extremist attacks is hard to overlook. They've been skyrocketing since the 1990s. One study said far-right ideology inspires about 300 violent attacks each year. And PBS recently reported that jihadist terrorists have killed 95 people in the U.S. since 9/11. Far-right extremists have killed 68 during the same time period. That number includes the death of a woman in Charlottesville on August 12th. The Anti-Defamation League studied 150 U.S. terrorist attacks inspired by the right wing in the past 25 years. They said most of the right-wing attacks are launched by white supremacists and anti-government extremists, and the majority of the violence carried out was aimed at specific human targets. The ADL says the right-wing extremist violence is undercovered in the media, partly because incidents often happen in rural areas, far from urban hubs. And partly, the ADL says, because there is inadequate awareness among policymakers and the public alike of the threat posed by violent right-wing extremists.
Okay, so this particular video is about 1.5 years old already, so they haven't included some of the most recent ones. And I don't need to remind everyone, surely you've heard about the recent Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting or the El Paso, Texas Walmart shooting. The El Paso one, the suspect explicitly said that he was anti-Hispanic. He called it an Hispanic invasion. So, the bottom line is, what the takeaway from this is, it doesn't matter what the suspect's description is or what their ethnicity is or color or background or whatever it is. People of all shapes, sizes, and colors and backgrounds, all of them have the potential to be a suspect when it comes to terrorist actions. We got to make sure that when we're getting a call about someone, we definitely want to collect the suspect's description and all the other information that's associated with them. But regardless of what that description is, regardless of what their ethnicity or background is, we still want to treat it as a potential terrorism investigation. Okay, so what are those signs that we might see when someone's calling in to, or what we might hear about, I should say, or see by ourselves, when someone is calling in to report potential suspicious activity, potential terrorism activity? And typically, those are listed as 8 categories of suspicious things that someone might report to the PSAP that they saw that could be an indicator of potential terrorist planning or terrorist activity. The first one we'll talk about is surveillance. And look, taking photos and video of popular landmarks and things like that is not uncommon. I think all of us at one point have probably been, on vacation or something during our lives with our families. You go to New York City, you go to Los Angeles, you go to, overseas, whatever, and you're out there, you're taking photos, you want to take videos on your phone, the cameras and things. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think it becomes suspicious when the photography or videography is unusual, when they seem to be more interested in recording critical infrastructure. They're taking photos. Most people who go on vacation don't take photos and pictures of critical infrastructure like power plants and things like that. If they're more interested in taking pictures of buildings and things like that, then look, in the United States, you can go to the Hoover Dam, definitely critical infrastructure, and it's a whole tourist attraction. So, obviously there's some room for that. But when somebody seems more interested in recording or watching the security apparatus or critical infrastructure, they're taking pictures of the cameras, they're taking pictures of the security personnel, They're wandering around and watching for when the uniformed personnel are going in and out. Also, this would include unusual monitoring of communications, that they're listening into radio frequencies and things like that. That's not something that people normally do on vacation. And again, it could be completely harmless, but it could also be something that maybe we should be investigating a little bit further and taking a closer look at. Maybe something will come of it. Maybe it's nothing, and the person is just an enthusiast, and that's okay. But it's worth taking a closer look at. So that's surveillance. Next, we have suspicious questions. Look, most people, when they go out with their families or they're out and about and they go to a big location, they're more interested in what they're there to do than the local security precautions. I mean, here in Rockland County, we have the 6th biggest mall in the United States, the Palisades Center Mall, and it's the 2nd largest mall east of the Mississippi River. So it's not a small shopping mall, and people come from all over the region and, in fact, from overseas. I mean, they really come to visit the mall and enjoy the facilities. When I go to the mall, whether I'm going there to shop or have to go to the restaurant or go to the movies, I'm interested in what I'm there to do. I'm interested in what restaurant we're going to or what store we're going to. I'm not concerned about how many cops are on duty or where the emergency exits are or what the security plans are for evacuation. I don't care about any of that. And I'm a guy who used to work in the field, and my field area covered the Palisades Center Mall, so I even know that stuff already, and I'm still not looking at where the back door is or where the security guards sit or whatever. I don't care about any of that. So when somebody comes into the mall and they're asking all these suspicious questions about, how much police coverage there is and where the emergency exits are and things like that, that's something that should raise our level of suspicion. Most people don't really care about that sort of thing. Again, could be an innocent question, but if you get suspicious questions, then that sort of raises your level of suspicion and you feel like you want to report that. This would also include seeing things online, threats against, a large facility. When you see online, people are online discussing about, what would happen if something, blew up there, or what would happen if there was a shooting there, how would we handle it, and so forth. Again, reasonable discussion is one thing, but it's something that most people don't bother discussing online. They don't like to think about that sort of thing when they go to the shopping mall, the airport, or wherever location that they go to. Suspicious questions are sometimes reported in it. Next, we have security tests. This is where they will go and they will try to test the response of the responder's ability to handle. They'll go and they'll leave that suspicious package or bag in the facility. They'll cut locks or pull the fire alarm or things like that and see how long it takes the responders to get there. See, how far they go in examining to see whether it's a threat or not, and then they'll adapt their plans based on the results. This is sort of the one where you get numerous false fire alarms or burglar alarms from a particular location because it's not just a faulty detector. It's that somebody's intentionally doing it, both to gauge how long it takes them to get there and also to sort of wear down their awareness and say, oh, yeah, it's just a false alarm from that place again. We go there a million times a day, and then take your time. Well, it turns out that they did that to wear you down and get you burned out about, going to the same place every time and being callous about it. This is also when we have people who, somehow, quote unquote, somehow make their way into a secure area of the facility. They're in the back hallway, or they're in the secure area, and when the security or police investigate, oh, there's an accident. I made a left when I should have made a right, and I'm sorry. Okay, that does happen to people once in a while, that they accidentally wander into a protected area, but it's not something that should be happening on a regular basis, and certainly it should raise our level of suspicion. Most people, if they're in the mall or they're in the airport or whatever, they don't try to get in the wrong way. They don't try to sneak into the protected area. They don't even wander that way. They're just trying to get on their plane and get on with their lives. So that would be security tests. Funding. They need money in many cases to pull off these terrorist actions. They might need supplies and fuel and weapons. You got to buy that somehow, and the only way to do that, if you don't have the money, is to get it somehow. Certainly, they might commit crimes as part of this. They might commit burglaries or robberies, drug deals, human trafficking, weapon sales, all these things that they can do in order to raise the cash for their planned action, so that they can buy the materials. Also, this would include suspicious cash transfers. Most people who go into, a Home Depot or a Lowe's or go to rent a truck, they use a credit card, or maybe they use a check. Few people come in and buy, $2,000 worth of chemicals or fertilizer using a cash payment, and they slap the cash right on the counter. That would also be considered to be suspicious funding. online frauds, illegal charities, fake charities, things like that, large money transfers that seem suspicious, credit card fraud, online banking fraud, things like that. That's funding, another indicator of potential terrorism. And then once they have the money, they're going to get the supplies. Again, it's not illegal to buy chemicals, vehicles, weapons. I mean, we live in a country where you're pretty free to do what you want, but obviously it's a little suspicious when some people are coming in, especially if they're paying cash, something like that, and they're buying all sorts of weird chemicals, fertilizer, radio equipment, vehicles, weapons, ammunition. They might also not just buy the materials, they might just go and steal it, break into cars, especially law enforcement when they're stealing weapons or they're trying to target law enforcement vehicles. Unusual amounts of chemicals or beauty supply products, again, buying shampoo or whatever, not illegal. When somebody goes in and cleans out the whole beauty supply store and buys 20 cases of particular soap or whatever, that might seem a little suspicious, and it might be reported in. Again, could be legitimate. The guy might be running a hairdressing school, or he might be having a flea market sale, whatever it is. But certainly it's something that should merit further investigation. And certainly if it's sensitive things like law enforcement IDs, weapons, building plans, uniforms and things like that, badges, obviously those raise our level of suspicion quite a bit in terms of acquiring unusual supplies. Suspicious person out of place. This is more along the lines of when we see the person who's not supposed to be in the secure area, when we have people who are wearing official-looking uniforms or are trying to get official-looking paraphernalia, IDs, vests. We sometimes hear about this once in a while in the news. We just heard this recently with the plastic surgeon. I think it was in New Jersey. I can't remember what state, but they found out they need a huge cache of weapons and police-style, vests and all kinds of things in his house. Obviously those are all suspicious. Certainly if they're out and about in an unusual vehicle, the vehicle is supposed to look official, or if they're trying to get into doors or sneak into places that they shouldn't be going into, secure areas, locked buildings. Again, it could be just somebody who's trying to burgle the place. It's a low-level crime. It gets treated as a burglary, and we'll handle that like any other. But it could also be something where the person is trying for something a little bigger. And again, it's something that may not result in an arrest right now, but it should be reported so that it can be further analyzed. Dry runs or trial runs. And this is something that typically happens shortly before the terrorist act occurs. Sometimes, again, they're going to plan this out. They're going to make sure it's 150% to the best of their ability before they go live. And they're going to go out there and they're going to drive the routes. They're going to place their materials. They're going to, test the escape routes. This would also include unusual training. When you have somebody who goes and suddenly he decides he wants to learn how to start flying planes. And he's never flown a plane before, and he just came in from out of the country, or something like that. Again, it's not illegal to learn how to fly a plane. Many people do it. They seem to enjoy it. I understand it's very cool, but certainly it could indicate something a little more nefarious going on. Other unusual skills, using unusual weapons, unusual first aid skills, all these sort of practice and training things that they might do shortly before the terrorist action gets underway would be considered suspicious. And then we have deploying assets, and this is usually the last step. The deploying of the assets is usually occurring, not necessarily, but often occurring very close to when the terrorist act is planned to occur. This is where they deploy their assets like weapons, vehicles, supplies, and everything else so that it's ready for when they go to do the attack. They start stockpiling their materials, weapons, so that when they actually go in, they don't have to drive in with it. They can bypass the checkpoints or whatever, and they can pick up their materials and start hurting people. We saw that with the Mandalay Bay shooting, where he basically he rented the hotel room, and then he spent a few days dragging in through the hotel lobby in plain view of everyone these large duffel bags and things containing all the weapons and ammunition. He started stockpiling it up in the room, and after a couple days, when he had everything ready in the room, that's when he committed the terrorist act. Could also include deploying people as well, putting people in position, whether that be in some sort of residential thing, they rent an apartment or a hotel room, they might even take a job so that they can get access and things like that. So these are the 8 signs of potential terrorism that we might raise our spidey sense, so to speak, when we're getting that report from people on the phone. And these sorts of signs and reports are definitely something that we should be reporting up the chain so that they can be further analyzed. Again, this is probably not something where they're going to suddenly send in the SWAT team. Excuse me. I mean, they might. But most of these times when we're reporting this information, the goal is for further information analysis and sort of later handling. Of course, if somebody's there with a weapon or a bomb, or you have a report of something going on right now, obviously send the appropriate resources. We need to share that information when we get it. When we're getting that suspicious activity information, we need to share it. And again, one of the things we learned after previous terrorist attacks, especially 9/11, was that in the past, information sharing was limited, or there was no information sharing. It was siloed, or people downplayed it and said, what's the chance of the terrorist action? It's probably nothing. We've got to share that information. Again, doesn't always result in an immediate arrest. There's usually not a sort of satisfactory outcome where you report something and then 5 minutes later the SWAT team busts down the door and catches everybody in the act. The information might not even prove itself immediately useful. It might just be sort of filed away. But as the Fusion Center and we'll talk about what a Fusion Center is, but as the authorities get more information from other people and they get more tips and they get more clues and they kind of sort of start to, put on their detective hat and piece it together and do data analysis, that's when the picture may start to emerge. So the information you give today it might never be used. It might be something that no one ever has to take action on, and that's the end of it. But we need that information so that we can plug it together later. You can't wait until the last second and suddenly, we're not going to see that. We need the information together so that we can look at it. We can say, listen, this person is associated with that person, and they spoke to this person, and they did this, and he did this, and she did that. And that's the only way we're going to be able to come to conclusions in these sort of complex terrorism investigations and hopefully prevent future terrorist actions. The federal government has deployed some programs to encourage people, both in public safety and civilian, to report suspicious activity when they might come across it. The most popular one, probably the most well-known one, is the See Something, Say Something program. It's a partnership between the Department of Homeland Security, the NYPD, and also the Metropolitan Transit Authority. It's the New York Transit Authority. It was a partnership. It was the first one. It was a partnership between all three. It was developed shortly after September 11th in order to help people report both public safety and also private civilians to report things that might be considered suspicious. The goals of the See Something, Say Something program are to, first of all, raise public awareness of suspicious events. Let people know that, hey, when you see a guy who's in a place he shouldn't be, or when you see someone who's buying unusual materials or weapons or chemicals, that should be considered suspicious. It's not something you should keep under your hat. You should say something about it. They emphasize the importance of reporting those events to the authority. They used to tell people to call a hotline, a state hotline, or a regional hotline to report that 800 number to report these sorts of things. And you probably have seen the NYS Safe or whatever. They're still out there, but at this point, the Department of Homeland Security has realized or recognized that most people are just going to call the local police department. So they've sort of changed their guidance and said, the numbers are still out there, but at this point they're mostly just advising people to hit up the local law enforcement agency and let them know and take it from there. So we can expect to get those calls if you're not getting them already. They do give the public tools. You can download an app and things like that. I don't know how many people actually do that. If you have it, that's great. But I think most people are just going to call their local law enforcement. The goal overall was to create a partnership. Citizens, private citizens, businesses, law enforcement, other public safety agencies, and fusion centers to sort of gather this information and analyze it and hopefully prevent future action. So what is a fusion center? And you might have heard that term sort of floating around. Someone says something about a fusion center. A fusion center does one thing. It does data analysis and reporting. It's a national network of locations. There's not one fusion center. It's nationwide, and they are typically run by the states. As far as I can tell, every state in the union has one. And sometimes you'll have some more local ones also, some regional ones, especially if you're a larger city like New York City, has a fusion center. It depends on exactly where you are, but usually the state is the one that's providing the fusion center. They get funds from the federal government to make it happen, and I'm sure they kick in their own money as well. So a fusion center is a data analysis place that receives information from all kinds of sources: private citizens, businesses, law enforcement, emergency responders, whatever. Wherever they're getting their information from, they fuse that information together to create a larger picture. Again, they're getting a tip about somebody who rented a truck there, and they're getting a tip that somebody did an online fraud and then took the money in cash or whatever, and they're getting a tip about somebody who bought fertilizer and chemicals or weapons. And again, those individual data points by themselves, not necessarily criminal, not necessarily illegal, but when they sort of fuse them or plug them all together, they're able to analyze the larger picture and say, wait a minute, this one particular person was involved in 3 different incidents and, he has a history of X, Y, Z. They're able to analyze that larger picture and create what they call information products, which are basically like newsletters or emails or bulletins that they would send out to their law enforcement and other partners to say, hey, after analyzing it, maybe you guys should take a little closer look at, this particular person, or, see if you have any events going on in your jurisdiction that match this criteria. Have you had any incidents where the suspect did A, B, and C, because we've seen that elsewhere. So they're gonna disseminate those information products out to their partners. And again, if you work for a law enforcement agency, you probably have seen these bulletins come out from time to time from from state authorities or from your regional authorities, where they say, hey, keep an eye on this or keep an eye on that in case you see anything. They sort of disseminate that out. Again, sometimes it turns out to be nothing. Sometimes it turns out, again, fortunately it's pretty rare, but sometimes it does turn out that they are able to sort of avoid or thwart a potential terrorist attack by use of these information gathering and information sharing. So these people who work in the Fusion Center are primarily concerned with investigation and data analysis. They're not out there gathering the information. They get information from the field, and they analyze it, they check it out, they decide whether it's worth regional dissemination, maybe national dissemination, depending on the nature. And they're, if it's a national dissemination sort of thing, then they're going to share that through other Fusion Centers, through the NSI network. They're going to share that with other Fusion Centers in other states and other cities to let them know, hey, we got something that you might be interested in. That being said, the people who work at Fusion Centers, look, they might be police, law enforcement. They might be. There are some places where the people who work at the Fusion Center are law enforcement and they carry the shield, but certainly they might not be. Again, the people who are working at the Fusion Center are not out there gathering information. There's no, they don't have agents that they can send out and do questioning or arrests. It's not like a detective bureau where the detectives are going to go out on the street and gather information and bring people in for questioning and things like that. That's not what a Fusion Center does. The Fusion Center relies on law enforcement partners to bring that information in. They're not actually reaching out to do any investigation themselves. They're relying on others to bring that information to them for the numbers to be crunched. So sharing information with a Fusion Center, so important, because if you don't share it, they have unless somebody else happened to report it to them, they have no way of getting that information unless you report it. Very, very important. Now, if you report something into the Fusion Center, you might get a communication back from them saying, hey, we looked into it, it's nothing, or hey, we looked into it, it's something. You might get a feedback from them, or you might not. Every Fusion Center is a little different. Some Fusion Centers don't provide any feedback at all. They don't provide any reply. They just say thank you for the information and have a nice day, and that's the end of it. It doesn't depend on the quality of the information in that case. It's not a matter of they only reply if it's important or whatever. That if you didn't receive feedback, it doesn't mean anything in particular. It could be they did something with it. It could be that they just don't reply back to contributors. It really depends on how they do it at their particular Fusion Center, so don't get discouraged if that's the case. Some do, some don't. So when do you report to the Fusion Center? How do you do that and when? Well, that's going to depend on your local policy and procedure at your center. Again, I remind you to follow all your local, policies, procedures, and everything else. Some agencies, especially if you work for a bit of a larger agency, a larger law enforcement agency, you might have a dedicated liaison officer or an intelligence unit that deals with homeland security. Again, if you work for a very large city like New York City, of course, they have their own counterterrorism people, and they handle that internally. But again, follow your local procedure. Of course, if your agency doesn't have a procedure, or if your agency has a procedure where you report it to to the fusion center, then maybe that's the way to go. Again, follow whatever your commanding officer tells you to do. Bottom line, if you do end up reporting to a fusion center, if you do end up calling the 800 number or submitting the tip online, whether you're doing it personally as a private citizen or whether you're doing it officially as part of your job, just remember, all the received information that the fusion center gets is reviewed very seriously. They are not going to laugh you off the block and say, they'll waste my time with that. That's not going to happen. I'm not saying that anything's going to happen as a result. Maybe it turns out that the person was innocent. They're just renting a truck. It happens, Or maybe it turns out that it's suspicious, but it's nothing we need right now. Bottom line is it's not going to be ignored. It's not going to be ignored. They may do something with it. They may not do something with it. They may just file it away. They may just keep it in mind for future use, but they are not going to hang up the phone on you. Remember, they can't get the information directly. They don't have their own investigative methods, generally speaking. So it's very important that partners like us as public safety telecommunicators are providing that information to the center. So we're getting these reports in the center, and we get calls about, if you're anything like our center, you get quite a few suspicious activity calls. They call to report, quote-unquote suspicious or whatever. And some of these calls, I know public safety telecommunicators are getting those calls, and they say, really? Somebody sneezed the wrong way. Look, the bottom line is sometimes we get these trivial events. And to be fair to the telecommunicators, 99.9% of them are nothing. There's a bag over there. Okay, somebody left a bag there. It turns out after all that it was nothing. It was just somebody accidentally left, bag fell out of their car or whatever. But some of these trivial events, unfortunately, occasionally do prove to be valuable. And we don't want to get burned out and say, there's another, it's probably nothing. Who cares? We've taken 1 million of these. That's what these suspects are relying on. They're relying on your complacency to say, it's nothing, don't worry about it. We never get anything legitimate on this. You don't want to be complacent on that. You've got to be willing to pick up on these potential, we spoke about the 8 signs, surveillance and suspicious questions and funding and all trial run and all that. We've got to be willing to pick up on these potential activities and make sure that we're properly giving them to the right people to be investigated or handled appropriately. So when you get those reports from your callers, do follow the 5 W's, right? The what, the where, the when, the how. And yes, do collect the quote-unquote who information. Do collect the details, descriptions of the suspects or suspects. Their address and their height and their weight and their skin color and their background and their vehicles and their email addresses and all that other sort of things. Definitely collect all that information regardless of what they're reporting. But at the same time, don't take that sort of who information into account when we're deciding whether we should act on suspicious activity calls. When somebody is renting a truck and buying fertilizer, I don't care what their skin color is or their nationality or their history or what. I don't care about anything of that. Because people of all nationalities and backgrounds can commit these terrorist acts against our country, and we need to be vigilant for that. Don't become complacent. Don't prejudge the caller, and that includes the other way also. Sometimes we see telecommunicators who get the call from the public reporter, and they call in, what's the emergency? Well, I saw a guy who's got brown skin, and he's speaking like a strange language, so I want to report that he might be a terrorist. And sometimes the telecommunicator, worried about the Muslims again, this is crazy, please don't you prejudge either, okay? We have to treat them all the same, regardless of their skin color or background or whatever. We have to assume that, yes, even if the person seems to be a little discriminatory, it could still be something. They might be right. It happens. So regardless of the suspect's description or whatever, we don't want to let that affect our judgment when it comes to how we process the call and how we escalate it or how we investigate it. Some people might call the 800 number or go on the internet to the Fusion Center to report this sort of information. Again, I think it's fair to say that most people are going to call their local police agency. Some people are going to call 911. And I think that's what most people would do. I think that's fair to say. Most people don't bother going up online and looking up the information. They just call their local police department because that's who they're accustomed to speaking with when it comes to law enforcement matters. And as I mentioned, at this point, the federal government has pretty much sort of thrown in the towel and said, they're probably going to call the police department first, so we're just going to tell them to call law enforcement. And that's actually what the materials say now. It says call your local law enforcement. But the numbers are still out there. They might report directly in. But because we're probably going to get a fair number of these calls, People are going to call the local agency, and that means that public safety telecommunicators, us, we're in a critical spot for making sure that that call isn't wasted, that it's properly elevated and escalated, and handled properly, whether it's reporting to your own internal law enforcement detective bureau, or you have a unit, or even if your policy at your agency says to report it directly to the fusion center, whatever it may be. Make sure it's handled properly when we're getting these calls, because we're going to get them. Of course, when it comes to quote-unquote regular calls, there's always the potential for terrorist action against the responders. Always keep that in mind. I don't want to rehash all the recent, not recent, but I don't want to rehash all the situations you no doubt have heard of in the past where they went out there for a quote-unquote regular incident, a domestic, a building fire, an EMS call, or anything like that, and it turned out that it was actually a trap set for the responders. Webster, New York. I don't want to get too far into it. I think we've all heard those 1,000 times at this point. But again, keep that in mind. That we always want to keep that in mind, that even if it is a quote-unquote typical call, it could be the planning for a targeted attack on these responders. And even if the attack has already occurred, if you're already getting reports in your center of a shooting, or if you're already getting reports of an active assailant, or you're already getting reports of a bomb that went off or something like that, again, remember, there might be a secondary attack on the responders. You need to make sure we're keeping responders apprised on the radio or however you communicate with your responders about the potential for a secondary attack. Even if it's just regular scene dangers, of course, we don't want to forget about that either. Friends, family, and bystanders, domestics, things where people are waiting for the cops and things like that. We don't want to be, or even the fire and EMS at this point, unfortunately. We don't want to get complacent with that sort of thing also. So, of course, make sure that you're keeping vigilant even when the call appears to be non-terrorist related. I'll just mention, if you're in New York, again, the See Something, Say Something program, we have it here in New York, New York State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, 1-866-SAFE-NYS, that's 866-723-3697, or you can go on the website, or you can download the app, ny.gov/safeguardny, where you can anonymously, if you want, you don't have to be anonymous, but you can safely and anonymously report any suspicious activity that you want. Again, when it comes to your official actions and in your job, you should follow your local agency's policy. Some agencies may have you sort of escalate that to a law enforcement officer, a detective, a unit, a counterterrorism unit, or things like that if it comes in. Follow your local agency's policy if you're getting those reports. So, sharing information, so important. We're getting a lot of these calls, about quote-unquote suspicious activity. What the person is doing, what the suspect is doing now might not be necessarily criminal or suspicious on their own, or it might be criminal now, but it seems to be a low-level sort of incident that doesn't really get involved with terrorism. It's a burglary. Who thought about terrorism? But sometimes things come into play. What they stole, or where they stole it from, or when they stole it, or how they did it could be something that's of interest in terms of terrorism prevention. So we want to make sure that we share that information. Again, it may not go anywhere, but in this case, volume is our friend. Getting those data points coming in and reporting them up so that they can be analyzed is the only way we're going to have a chance of prevent. And again, fortunately, we have had the opportunity in the past. Law enforcement community has had the opportunity in the past to thwart some of them, but obviously, again, recent events, unfortunately, there have been plenty that have not been detected also, and people ended up getting hurt or killed as a result. So we want to make sure that we're sharing that information. So important. Regarding collecting, when somebody's calling into the PSAP, to the ECC, and they're reporting suspicious activity, again, we definitely want to collect the what, the when, the where, and the how, and so forth. And regarding that who information, we definitely want to get it all. We want to get all that information. But regardless of whether they report the person is, American, white, whatever, or whether they report the person is Middle Eastern, in a particular dress, a particular language, either way, we don't want to let our handling or processing of the call be affected by the information that we hear. We want to we want to assume right off the bat that all suspects, regardless of their ethnicity or background or language or what have you, all of them could potentially be dangerous in terms of a terrorist act. Don't let that affect how you handle the call or how you judge the activity. We spoke about the 8 signs of potential terrorism. Again, I think at this point, all the public safety responders, or at least have a vague familiarity with, what looks suspicious versus what doesn't look suspicious. But again, we want to collect that information and submit it so that it can be properly analyzed. You never know. We also spoke about fusion centers. and how they receive and process the data on these types of suspicious activity reporting. Again, they don't have their own investigative arms, generally speaking. There might be some that do, and I'm overgeneralizing, but for the most part, they're not designed to have investigative functions. They are relying on public safety, civilians, businesses to report that information in so that they can analyze it and put out information products. So make sure you share that information, because otherwise the Fusion Center might not be able to get that information. It's very important. Again, usually when we're getting these incidents on the phone, they're calling up to report a suspicious package, or they're reporting, something that they saw, suspicious activity. Usually it is not something that results in immediate action. Again, the one in New York City recently, where they alerted the counterterrorism officers to the rice cookers that were left on the subway platform. Yes, they ended up evacuating the station, and they ended up, looking into it. Turned out, fortunately, they were bogus devices. They weren't real. But usually that's not the case. Usually these sorts of reports that we get, it's not something that's happening imminently, and it's something where we sort of analyze it for later. So we shouldn't expect necessarily that. Yeah, again, if it is something like the New York City incident where it requires immediate action, by all means, dispatch the appropriate resources. But don't get discouraged if that's not what happens immediately. Say, look, I went through all this trouble to report it, and they just said, thank you, we'll look into it, whatever, and they didn't do anything. In a lot of cases, that's the idea. The point is to process the information and analyze it and take investigation and action later, not something that we're sending. Again, if you have something that's going on right now, you have a suspicious device, you have a package, you have a weapon, something going on right now, obviously send in the appropriate resources. So, again, a lot of us are probably getting these calls in our center, and the federal government is sort of, at this point telling people just call your local law enforcement agency. So we're going to continue to get these calls. Maybe we'll get more calls. So we're going to get a lot of street-level information, and we might get these information based on other calls. The caller might be reporting something else, a medical, a fire, or something. They're just reporting another type of incident or something innocuous. But while you're listening to the caller, you realize, hey, wait a minute, that's suspicious. That does not sound right. That is also something that we should be sharing with the appropriate people, so that, look, just because the caller was calling to report a parking complaint, or just because the caller was calling to report a medical, but they mentioned something that was disturbing. They mentioned something that was raising our spidey sense about the possibility of terrorist activity. We want to refer that up and share that information so that they can analyze it. Might be nothing, but you never know. It might be something. But again, follow your, recognize potential terrorist suspicious activity, and follow your local procedure for reporting that information to the appropriate people. And of course, as we always say, remember the potential risks to responders, whether the incident is terrorist related or not, whether it's just a regular local incident or whether it is a potential terrorist incident, whether the incident's going on right now or it's just something you heard about going on in the future. Remember the potential risk to your police, fire, and EMS who are out there on the street. Nobody wants to be in that situation where a first responder gets injured or hurt, and gathering the information and sharing it appropriately can sometimes help us to avoid that situation. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on terrorism awareness for public safety telecommunicators. There's my contact information up there on the screen. Again, if you're not following us on Facebook, please feel free. It's facebook.com/44control, and there's my email address as well. I encourage you to reach out if you need more information, or if you have questions, or if you want to discuss it. Other than that, I'll be glad to take any questions that are typed in now. But if not, then I hope to see you at our next one. Thanks, everybody.